Well, I'd say the former mayor set us up rather perfectly, although I'm not sure I would have picked two white guys to come out and host this after that.
We are still white.
We are still white.
Just like last year.
We are. You were. Yeah.
We agree with you.
Yes, you noticed. Well, as you were included in his remarks, why don't you address it first?
Well, I mean, this is sort of the story, the underlying story of Detroit we're still not comfortable talking about, I think. This idea of moving together as one city instead of two cities, thinking about inclusion at every level. And, you know, I think we're here to talk about gentrification. I think what the mayor laid out fits into that subject very well. And, you know, I think we should start by getting our panel's thoughts on what Mayor Bing said about African Americans being shut out in terms of the business community, the civic community, the leadership roles in the city. Rashida, could we start with you? What was your reaction to the remarks?
I think if you live in the city of Detroit, you're seeing the change happen, and you're seeing it happen that your neighbor or the business that you've been going to for years is not thriving, but the new kind of business that I've been coming in, if you think it's bad or good or whatever you think, it's not inclusive of the fact that it's incorporating the people that already been here and been doing business and been really, you know, desiring the support that has been here for businesses, but they're not actually being able to access it. So I think Mayor Bing was on point. I think we all see it and we feel it. We, you know, even talking together about gentrification and how just such an icky word, it feels really bad. And wow, our property values are going up and everything. But Nolan, when you see those businesses not thriving, where you have, and no offense to the folks that were just out here, but they're talking about insects or something no, I mean, it's not bad. It's just, but it's true. I mean, that to us is not the Detroit we know, right? But is it a bad thing? Absolutely not. But I want to hear from my neighbors that have been doing a phenomenal job, have not left, love this city so much, and the loyalty that they have, I mean, the kind of investment you make on a Detroiter is, you can completely get the reinvest. It just comes back 10 times fold. And so it's really important that we acknowledge that it is happening, and yes, it's negative. Do we want to throw folks out? Absolutely not, but we need to have a good balance of it, Nolan, and it's not a good balance right now.
Well, Rod, you're involved in bringing development to Detroit and working with all these new investors. Is it as exclusive as the mayor portrayed? Are we getting a diverse business base in this city?
I think it's very challenging. And one of the things, you know, just starting it off is, as someone who's been here a little over a year now, I can say Detroit is one of the most welcoming communities I've ever experienced in my life. Great people here, great opportunities here. So I've heard the sentiment, well, maybe Detroit is just not welcoming of outsiders. That's not what it is. But we're failing as an economic development community, as a business community, as a leadership community, if Detroiters don't have those opportunities to make investments. And I have seen in certain circles a discount of the talent and of the young people in the city. And I think there needs to be a very assured focus on making sure that locals have an opportunity to participate in the economic expansion that's happening here.
Let me ask, Ron Bartell, the mayor's quote was that a lot of African-American developers and contractors are on the outside looking in at the new Detroit. You are one of the real success stories. A lot of people have pointed to what you've done with Kuzzo's Chicken and Waffles over there on Livernois. Lots of talk about expansion, all kinds of things. It's been a great success story. So I'm curious as to your reflections on what the mayor had to say.
It's pretty powerful. I'm still digesting some of it.
Sure.
But I happen to agree with him. There's an undercurrent going on in the city, and it gets talked about. We talk about it. I think the difference is I'm from here. I grew up in these neighborhoods. We're not making an impact in the neighborhoods, and that's where these conversations are really having place in the neighborhoods. That people are feeling being left out. I'm coming from a different perspective because I moved out of here. I lived in D.C. I lived in St. Louis, and so I really wasn't here. So it's a little different for me. So being able to invest and having that capital that not a lot of people have access to, of course, it gave me a leg up. But even for me, opening a
It also
restaurant.
doesn't hurt being a former NFL player.
Right,
which
the cachet.
probably opens a door to.
Right, the cachet opens up the door to other things. But even for me, when I came back and decided to do the restaurant, I was told no plenty of times by the lenders. I owned the property free and clear. I had put my money up, put hundreds of thousands of dollars up into the properties, redevelop them, and I had the door shut on me multiple times. So for that to happen to me, you know, I made a lot of money playing professional football. So if it can happen to me, just imagine what can happen to somebody who has a great business plan, great idea, but doesn't have the financial
What ended
backing.
up making the difference? Where was the breakthrough?
The breakthrough was my own capital.
Which everybody has, fortunately, yeah.
You know, and I give credit because at the end of the day, DEG stepped up and Invest Detroit stepped up, but I had to make them believers. And you know, which is fine. I'll take that on my shoulders, and I'm glad, you know, they stepped up and I think we have turned them believers by the impact that we made, but yet and still, they didn't step up until the 25th hour where everything was ready to go and I paid my own capital. So it's hard.
Ken, jump in. What are your thoughts? Well,
one, I'm going to just say, isn't Detroit the greatest city on the planet? Woo! Don't you all agree? We'll start by saying that, but there has always been systemic barriers to entry, dealing with not just a city that I think is unlike any other place in the country. Let me paint a picture. So based off of just 2007 census tract statistics, African Americans have, entrepreneurship-wise, grown 3 times the national rate. Why that is significant to Detroit is that there are more than 32,000 African American firms, which is ranked number 4 in the entire country behind New York, LA, and Chicago. So when you have a large percentage of African American businesses, not all mom and pop shop, because I want to paint another clear picture as well. Out of Black Enterprise magazine, Devin, top 100, 23 of those companies exist here in metropolitan Detroit. So there are billion-dollar African-American businesses with capacity, scope, and scale ready to do business, and they're not included to a certain degree within the revitalization of the city of Detroit and therefore even the state. So my thing is, thanks to some of the progressiveness of the mayor to see some of these things regarding inclusion and participation, he's addressed and brought businesses to his office to see how we could close the gap. But more importantly, we got a
You're talking about the current mayor.
The current mayor,
yes.
Absolutely. We have a long way to go. And if you think 64% of all businesses in Detroit are Black, regardless of Gilbert, regardless of Illich, the folk who stayed in the community and made it possible for this city to even have the discussion that it's having, those people are not included. And so I appreciate Nolan for bringing up this discussion, making it a real discussion, but we got a long way to go. And it starts with this panel here. It starts with intentional dialogue in the neighborhoods. And more importantly, we can highlight how we can rebuild this city together. Right. And I believe Detroit, unlike any other place in the country, this place outside of the continent of Africa has the largest percentage in population of Black folk in density. And so think about that discussion. There is diversity here. We don't have to talk about how do we get diversity. It's diversity. Just go around the block. So let's have a real discussion and let us intentionally take this dialogue to the next level. And I appreciate the regional chamber for starting it today.
You've painted a really complicated picture there, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Rashida, in the community, is there a sense that the exclusion is intentional or just a matter of circumstance?
Well, I think just from our past experiences, various administrations, it feels intentional. And I think perception is reality. The fact of the matter is, when you see others thriving and you're not thriving, and may be all kinds of institutional like barriers and things that we've talked about a little bit here, it is very painful to see so many families be able to move from out of the city, move into the city in nice homes and be able to afford those homes, that have the nice parks, that have access to the grocery stores and so forth. When we're all, many of us young parents, myself, been looking for over a year and a half and not being able to have that kind of access to lending. I mean, one of the greatest things that we always been, I think, undervaluing our home value in Detroit. We have the most beautiful homes in the city of Detroit. I mean, extraordinary homes. You can't find anything like them anywhere. And you come in and they want 150, but the lender's like, it's only worth 100. But then the person comes outside, has mommy, daddy cash access, comes in, was able to pay the difference between the appraisal and the cost of the home. then it's happening. I talk to my friends all the time about it, and we're, having to get the hole in the roof and all those things, and having to live in part of the house while we renovate the other, but others are able to come in. It's not their fault. They have this opportunity, they're coming in. But I do think, and I talked to Rod about this, I think there is an intentional hiking of price value in certain neighborhoods that feel very intentional of keeping certain people out.
Rod?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, one of the things is there has to be intentional protections put in place. So whether it's tax-free zones where you say, okay, we're going to lock in a tax rate so that as values rise, that people that have been living in neighborhoods aren't pushed out. Rehab programs that allow people, loan programs that allow people to actually fix up their places. Those are the sorts of things that I would say are absolutely necessary from a policy perspective. The other thing is that I would encourage those that own in Detroit not to sell. I don't care where you live in the city. This is a city that is being rediscovered in the national and in the global context, and your value, no matter where you are in the city, is going to increase. So I encourage those that own in the city to keep their properties.
But when you're sitting down and you're plotting out the future of the city, the development future of the city, how the city's going to grow, how big a role does inclusion play in that conversation?
It's a critical piece of it. And I'll say this. So what we know is that national credit tenants, major national corporations, they are going to go primarily in downtown, midtown, maybe a few other areas of the city as the market dictates. But we know that small and medium-sized business, primarily diverse, inclusive businesses, are going to be the ones that are going to allow the neighborhoods to recover first. And those businesses prove the viability of the market in a community. So whether it's Motor City Match or the D2D program or other things that we have focused on small business, small and medium-sized business, those are all programs focused on the neighborhoods. The other side of that equation, though, is that the market, as a place becomes more attractive, prices go up. And there's
that's
nothing,
good,
This is
right?
what I was going to ask
That's a good
Rashida. Rashida, if I could play devil's advocate for a second. Anybody from another of the nation's large cities, first off, anybody from Chicago would hear you talking about a $160,000 house, and after they got over the maniacal laughing fit, they would say, are you kidding me? This is still the most reasonably priced city that you can find anywhere. But secondly, the alternative then, once there's a neighborhood that as it becomes more livable and becomes more attractive, of course people like you want to live there. So I guess the only choices seem to be that the neighborhood succeeds and values go up, or it doesn't succeed and values either stagnate or fall, which we've seen forever. Those may be the only choices, aren't they?
But Devin, when you have a house value and you are middle class, you're going into a lender and they're telling you the value of the house is not at the service. That's why I think the Mayor Duggan just announced this program.
Yes, absolutely. And
so there is a gap.
There
is a gap.
real,
It is tailored towards those that have higher. I can't get a loan from my credit union, I've been with for a decade, for a house that is overvalued $30,000, $40,000. We're not even talking 10 grand or 20 grand. We're talking $30,000 to $40,000. And everyone that has experienced it personally know what I'm talking about. And so those are barriers, those are issues. And we're going to try to handle it. But even some of the programming that I hear about when I talk to small businesses, they don't know about these programs. And how do you get that information? It's like one of the things I heard from a small business that was really struggling, I said, don't you dare sell, keep thriving. And I said, did you call DEGC? Did you call, it's all about who you know. And this dynamic that's happening in Detroit and Ken, you're smiling, but it's true. Yeah. It's the relationships and who knows who. And not that, again, Nolan, and it's not intentional, but that's how the system is going. We're not doing a better job. We're not going fast enough to catch up with the fact that we don't have these kinds of programs in place.
I mean, this is a fascinating conversation. It is. I mean, Detroit to me is the last major undeveloped city in the country. If you look at it, you could come to Detroit, it's a paintbrush. You could do anything you want, nobody will stop you if you're doing it legally. But for me to speak on this I've lived all over this country because of my career. I've lived in D.C., so I've seen gentrification happen firsthand. I remember the first week I was at D.C., I transferred to Howard University. I went to a Popeye's Chicken on the corner where it was a guy shooting heroin inside the Popeye's Chicken. 5 years later, it's like a $3 million development condo right there in the middle of the neighborhood of DC. So when you talk about price values and things like that, I get it.
Now, clearly, wasn't that better for everybody?
Yeah,
Instead of having the guy that's shooting heroin in the Popeyes chicken?
What about the people that are paying $1,500 in rent because price values go up?
And that's what I mean. If the alternative is for a neighborhood not to succeed,
it's a touchy subject
that's tough.
because you need to create a tax base. This city was built for 2 million people. Where we at 600,000 now? Yeah. So you have to create a tax base. So it's just a touchy subject. I bought properties myself. I bought a property in the University District in the auction years ago. Bought it for $30,000. The amount of money I had to put in that property just to make it livable. Not that the everyday person doesn't have that money, so there's a gap there, like Rashida said. You can't just walk into the bank and say, I bought this property for $30,000, it only appraised it at $75,000.
Yeah.
Once I put $150,000, I may be able to get it appraised at $300,000.
Exactly.
The bank doesn't want to hear maybes. So how do we close this gap? How do we bridge this gap?
So you're out there helping rehab and restore a neighborhood far from downtown.
Oh, yeah.
So what's going on out in that 7 Mile Livernois area?
I mean, it's a lot going on. I've been, just when I first got in the NFL, I just always wanted to do something in Detroit. You know, guys were already coming back doing football camps and things of that nature. It was never my passion. So I started identifying neighborhoods back in 2005. The University District, the 7 Mile in the Livernois area. It's a great corridor. You have some of the most affluent people in the city living in this area. And it's so underserved. So back in 2005, when the market crashed, had a lot of properties available. So be able to get those properties and be able to rehab them and hold on to them, I've been able to do that because I've made a fortune playing football, but the average person can't do it. So like I said, I don't know how we bridge the gap, especially for somebody who just wants to have a nice home. Everybody wants the same things. So when we hear the new Detroit, I get so tired of hearing that. Everybody wants the same thing. We want a nice home, nice schools, safe environment. Everybody wants the same thing.
I think that's right. Absolutely. Ken, your thoughts on this dilemma of everybody wants the same thing. Everybody wants a successful neighborhood, and yet the more successful, the nicer that a neighborhood gets, it's going to get more expensive.
Yeah, I mean, let's paint a clear picture here, too. We have to be real about our discussion because we'll end up in bankruptcy again. So you can develop a downtown corridor from an economic perspective and leave the neighborhoods out and find yourself in the same depleting situation because you refuse to invest in the housing stock that existed that basically carried the city. So that's economics 101. The second thing is a diverse economy is a prosperous and a successful economy. Also, statistics and variations always show that economies that are not diverse and segregated are less successful and usually find themselves in cycles that continue to trend downward. So when you look at that in a perspective and you say to yourself, okay, do we want to compete with the rest of the country like we know Detroit has, as we know Detroit has led? We have been the beacon of the world due to the automotive industry. We can be that city again, but we must be real about our discussion and say development must be inclusive because in a majority minority community, a super majority minority community, by 2030, the entire country will be of minority descent. So that's not too far around the corner. So we have to have these inclusive discussions about participation, and Detroit can really be a beacon for the rest of the country. I truly believe, not only with the housing stock, everyone, due to lack of job opportunities, want access, and more importantly, that access cannot be limited, and it cannot be just for a few.
Okay, go ahead, Ryan.
That's a critical point. So by the reality that we're going to be a majority minority country, in very short order, by 2034. In 1983, whites had 5 times the wealth of blacks and 5 times the wealth of Latinos. Today, it's 6 times the wealth of Latinos, 7 times the wealth of blacks.
That's correct.
So we're feeding a divide, a class divide along racial lines. And Detroit is ahead of the rest of the country. We have an opportunity to create a model here in this city that shows how we can do sustainable development, and it has to be done in harmony. It has to be done in an inclusive fashion. Absolutely. We have to diversify the population, and we have to say we are a welcoming place for all people, but this is a place where not only do new people have opportunities, but people that have been here for 50 years.
Then what's the prescription for it? Because I think that we're... You mentioned earlier, you both said earlier, you used the word intention. You're going to have to do some things with some intention. And the big projects, like for instance, the Red Wings' new arena, you've got city council, you've got a lot of people paying attention to who's getting what. It's the smaller things maybe that maybe are not getting the same kind of scrutiny, the same kind of care. How do we end up fixing those?
Well, yeah, I would say it's the small things and the big things. On the big things, we've got, as Ken mentioned, we've got all of these large African-American companies in the Detroit region. Many of them are not in the city of Detroit, and I think they should be in the city of Detroit. And how do we create an environment that welcomes these large African-American companies to do significant, scalable work in the city of Detroit? It shouldn't always be about minority businesses doing small neighborhood stuff. That's important too, but we need the scalable stuff and we need the neighborhood stuff. We need access to capital. We need access to lending opportunities. We need to think about how do we best leverage our land to create zones where there's lots of employment. Employment is very, very important. How do we take advantage of the young people that are here? I feel like I've met so many young kids, 16, 17, 18 years old in this city who are brilliant, but they've been failed by our education system, and we continue to fail them and not believing that they have the capacity. So we have to figure out how do we create investments in these people so that they can launch businesses.
And Rod, let me say on to that, it's also about job creation. So let's even paint a real simple scenario from an economic perspective. If there's 32,000 African-American businesses in the city of Detroit, what if the banking industry and financial industry focused on those 32,000 and help those 1 to 5 employee businesses hire 1, 2, or 3 more people? Then you've just tripled or quadrupled your entire neighborhood economy. This is simple math, folks. This is not brain science. It's the intent to do and to build trust. Stephen Covey say, the speed of trust. Let's get at this really fast.
But it seemed to me like as if Mayor Bing's message went beyond the development and the makeup of the business community. He was talking about, in a larger sense, a voice and the loss of the African-American voice and leadership in this community. And that's not something we've talked a whole lot about.
It's a big deal.
Is there a sense that, and it seems incredible in a city that's gone through what this one has, over the last 30, 40 years in terms of a transition to a black power structure and black leadership. Is that slipping away?
I think we have a significant challenge because one piece of that challenge is this. There tends to be this underlying tension of race in every conversation in Detroit, and in very few contexts is it actually talked about overtly. And so until we can recognize that there's 80% Caucasian in the suburbs and 85% African American in the city and talk about living together, working together, and the reality that nobody can really have their full potential as an economy until we work and play together and actually live together and recognize that our futures are linked, we can't have a conversation about leadership or any of this other stuff.
But Rashida, I guess what I want to get at, is there a fear in the community that this changing Detroit, this reviving Detroit, and sort of a new sort of diversification is diminishing the black voice and black leadership?
I'll leave it to the African Americans on the panel. But I can tell you, and Devin and Nolan, just pay attention to the fact that, we talked about segregation, and there is that what happens, and sometimes it's organic, and we can say intentional or non-intentional, and if it's planned, but there is more and more segregation and poverty in certain neighborhoods. And I always talk about Northwest Detroit because what I love about Northwest is there's middle class, higher class, and lower class, and it works.
It's a dynamic.
It really, it works. It works really nicely. And so when you see that kind of mixed income and that integration of those that might work in different industry and those that have, maybe their own business, it works so well. And I looked at even civic engagement is so much higher in Northwest Detroit than other parts of the city. And as we look at different things happening, even around the downtown area, I'm worried about Martin Luther King apartments. I've heard rumors that more and more vacant properties there is happening, and there's development in the future for that area, but no one's really talking about it. And that's scary because that is an area, all that area. I remember Mayor Coleman Young having this progressive model of we're going to do mixed income. And I remember going into this complex, Devin, knocking doors, and there was a retired teacher, a retired police officer, was somebody that was on, assistance from the government and had children or raising their grandchildren or so forth. But that mixed income within the complex was working. It desegregates kind of the poverty that can, if you allow it to happen, it really gets us back into the situation we were in, years ago.
So should we be looking at Northwest Detroit as
Absolutely.
the example of Detroit's
Absolutely.
revival rather than, say, Corktown?
Absolutely. I'll put what we're doing, what we've done, I'll put that up against anybody. I haven't seen anyone come into the neighborhood and make that type of investment, and other than the liquor store or the strip clubs that they allow to go up in our neighborhoods. I haven't seen somebody come in and make that type of investment and do what we're doing. We have over 50 people that we employ. That's impact. You talk about leadership, that's leadership right there, taking care of your own, taking responsibility for yourself, and trying to uplift and empower people. I look at the impact we were making. We have, ever since we opened up, we have a $5 million development coming down the street. We have Bucharest Grill, which has multiple locations. They're coming down the street. I would like to think that they've been watching what we've been doing, how we've been seeing, and it pushed them over the edge to let them know they could come to the neighborhood and do things like this and make that type of investment.
Yeah. I'm curious as to whether, have you felt the ebb and flow at all? We've talked about emergency management. We've talked, the city in bankruptcy, then out of bankruptcy. Has that mattered to you at all? Has there been an ebb and flow to what you've been able to do, or are you sort of your own satellite, working independent of what's happening in the city in that sense?
Well, I work independent of what happens in the city, but it affects me because, for me, I don't live in Detroit. I still live out of the state, and I want to move back into the city. So I have to take into account all these things when I'm moving back to the city. I have to look at the school system. Do I want to can I send my child to a public school? I went to DPS. I went to Renaissance High School, but looking at the state of DPS right now, can I live in the city? Can I afford to live in the city if I have to pay higher taxes? I have to pay the proverbial hood tax. I have to pay,
they might not understand that, right?
For subsidized services. I mean, I'm just being open and honest. These are honest discussions.
That's right.
I have two groups of friends. I have groups of friends that stayed here, and I have groups of friends that left and went off to college. None of them live in Detroit, not one. The groups that stay here, they're working, they're hard-working people, they're honest, and they live all in the suburbs. The ones that left who wanted to come back, they haven't come back. Why is that? Because the cost of, you talk about the housing, okay, you could get a house for this much, but what about my taxes? What about
car insurance?
Car insurance. We've been redlined, so we have all these different factors.
The $45 parking ticket.
So many conversations that we have all circle back somehow around what we're going to do about education in schools. That's what Rob was just talking about, the young budding entrepreneurs in waiting that you meet who just need that opportunity, but that involves having mentorship, all the things that education provides.
That's a part of it. Education is the key to everyone's liberation. And it's life learning. We never stop learning. The moment that education isn't a priority, we've totally lost the game. But even most importantly, I look at it's about success in leadership. So I'm looking at a city that's super majority minority, super majority black. And then when you look at the folks making the economic decisions for the city, tell me how many people of African American descent are at the table making decisions. That's number one. The second thing is, not all black businesses are starving mom and pop shops in the city of Detroit.
Absolutely.
This was the first black middle class in America, created because of the migration, fair pay, even paying scale. People came here for a standard opportunity of equality and equity in this city. Now what you have is generational wealth that has been created, and we're losing that housing stock. But we still have a remnants of successful entrepreneurship. And so there are successful black firms all throughout the neighborhoods, successful stories like this, but folks you never even hear of that we highlight in Motor City Match, that we highlight in opportunities with other programs going on. And one thing I can say about Mayor Duggan, and if we agree on some things and disagree on another thing, he had a meeting with 50 African-American businesses based on retailers being moved out of the downtown area. In that meeting, he asked, with all of the financial resources around the table, have you heard of any of these access to capital needs? Only 3 out of the 50 raised their hand. And the mayor said, you know what? I need to focus on access to capital for black business. And I went even further and use statistics. because when you have a data discussion, it changes the discussion. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago did a study on loans given to black folk and minorities in the city of Detroit, and less than 5 were given by mainstream economic financial institutions in the last 5 years. That is absolutely dismal, and it's a blatant statement. So when I go to leadership boards and I look at the makeup of the leadership and the talent, and I don't see black people, that's a problem. And we can't even have a discussion of inclusion because policies will not dictate that inclusion. Most importantly, we need to have a real, I appreciate Councilwoman Brenda Jones on the CBA argument, the Community Benefits Agreement. I think that is a critical discussion. There are many people on all sides of the fence, but what about equitable negotiation when taxpayers have skin in the game? Should they benefit? And so these are the questions that we should be asking, and I think it's a real discussion. I'm glad to work with anyone from the chamber
fortunately,
perspective.
we're sitting here with a big fan of CBAs. Nolan, you want to jump in on this?
Well, the question I'd have for Ken, I mean, you've mentioned a few times the successful African-American business people, minority business people in this region, the billion-dollar company CEOs. Why aren't they playing a bigger leadership role in this community?
Well, they are with the chamber. I mean, I have to say, we are 5 years old now, the Michigan Black Chamber of Commerce. We were formed out of the census tract statistics that showed that African-American firms were growing 3 times the national rate. We have put chapters up in Grand Rapids, Lansing, Pontiac, Flint, Southfield, Detroit, Ann Arbor, and Ypsilanti in just 3 years due to the urban need for a black chamber of commerce. But more importantly, why we need chambers is because of access to capital, proper advocacy for policies that are going to effectuate urban environments and black business, and more importantly, to get to the types of training and education, and more importantly to your question, the GM, Fords, Chryslers, the Fortune 50, Fortune 500 companies that do care and have committed to the Chamber of Commerce to bridge the gap. So there are tremendous success stories with Chase Bank, with Bank of America, what the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation is doing. There's a tremendous opportunity, and I think everybody wants to play, but we need to have the right players at the table so that we can have a real discussion.
The only thing I would add to that, I mean, part of it is people want to do business in an environment where they're invited and where they're welcomed. If I've got $1 billion business, I don't want you to treat me like I've got a $50,000 business.
Right.
I want to be wooed. I want the same opportunities that I see other companies around the city and having. So I think one of the things is we've made a lot of progress, and I really hats off to Mayor Duggan and his ability to kind of really fix a lot of basic things. But we've still got a long way to go. And part of the long way to go is trying to figure out how do we engage with these businesses in a fashion where doing business in the city is just as easy as doing business outside of the city.
You've done this sort of work in other cities. Mm-hmm. How does Detroit differ? Is it the same situation everywhere, or are we in a unique space here?
We're in a unique space here. I mean, the reality is, and the city, of course, my most recent city was New Orleans, and there are a lot of comparisons that are made between Detroit and New Orleans, but they're very different scenarios. And I would say the uniqueness of the Detroit space is, one, talking about diversification of the economy, we need a much more diverse economy for our economy to be sustainable. That's one. Number two, we've got to grow the population base. It doesn't matter what we do in terms of targeting investments, but if you've got a city with an infrastructure for 2 million people and you've got 680,000, you can't be successful. I don't care, that there's a blank slate of bankruptcy or any of that stuff. We've got to grow the population base. The third thing that's really unique about Detroit is the culture of, it's a bit, from a business perspective, it's a bit homogenous. So the reality is you've got big auto. In recent years, we've got, of course, the rising tech stuff with the Gilberts and such. You can't build a strong business environment over time with only a couple of industries. We need 4 or 5 industries where we really hunker down. We need to say that we're open for business and we welcome people from all across the globe.
That's right.
That's our opportunity. We're the largest city on the border of Canada. So we need to look at foreign direct investment. There are just so many opportunities here in Detroit. But part of the challenge is we can't exploit the opportunities because we've got so many basic things that are still a challenge.
So when you were in New Orleans, was the conversation so dominated by race and by inclusion discussions?
Oh, absolutely. You've got some of those same racial dynamics in New Orleans, but I would say that you had you had much more of an integrated conversation. So what I tend to find here is that there's a lot of tension. There's one side that we need inclusion, and there's a fight, and we want to get our inclusion. There's another side that says, yeah, we want inclusion too, but may not be
they're
as...
afraid of that. They're afraid of including those folks, and that fear, we don't know how to address that fear. And I say we talk,
Yeah.
and we're very honest about that conversation. May it be the CBA debate, may it be other debate. There is this, who are they to have the right to be part of this conversation? Right. And my God, it's just so frustrating.
Yeah, it's called economic apartheid.
It should be we.
In fact, Rashida, I wanted you to address this, though, because here we are talking about this two Detroits conversation, and here we're talking about what's going on in Northwest Detroit as opposed to downtown or Midtown. Southwest Detroit is going, wait a minute, two Detroits? Aren't there at least three? Aren't there more than that? I mean, I think two Detroits is funny. I think there ought to be 100. There's 100 New Yorks. There ought to be at least 100 Detroits. But I'm curious about, because there's another section of the city that's trying to fit their way into this conversation too.
I mean, I remember even going to Northwest Detroit, just campaigning stuff, and they were like, but you're from Southwest. I was like, that's Detroit. And people, no, really, people thought it was a completely different, segregated kind of like an on its own community. But yeah, there is a struggle constantly. I mean, you know, Southwest Detroit, of course, people think Mexican town. By the way, that's only a street, I promise you. I know, it's only a street of, you know, restaurants, delicious restaurants. Please spend your money there. But beyond that, it's Southwest Detroit. And you have a strong African-American community with like 3-4 generations of families in South Schaefer. You have, obviously, you know, folks want to focus on the Latino community, but there's a huge amount of like European immigrants that came in from Hungary and Poland. It's a beautiful array of diversity. I mean, 20 different ethnicities.
It really is, yes.
But they constantly also feel left out. And even those that try to include, there's only particular people, again, it's the ones on this side that don't want those folks to come in. There's still the same dynamics that are constantly there about that conversation.
But you do have some of the most dynamic business strips, neighborhood business strips in Southwest Detroit. You go along Werner, and it's, you know, it feels like every storefront's filled with small businesses.
But I'll tell you, I give credit for, you know, Southwest Detroit Business Association, which I'm sure Ken knows of some, they work extremely hard. No matter, you know, I hear folks that talk, they work extremely hard to bring in private investment and public investment, both to just putting lighting and things that, you know, we were lacking on the city level of providing those services, those basic services.
You did it for yourselves, right?
Yes,
largely?
We worked it out together, but I think it was leadership from SDBA and others in the community that stepped up and said we have to do something and we have to do it.
But also, Rashida, you have to say Black lives matter, Black entrepreneurship matters.
Yes.
And so if you want to plan, you want to repopulate the city of Detroit, just go right where, you know, our famous corridor, the Avenue of Fashion, and let's just visit there. Let's focus on there. Let's bring, I would like to call 1 or 2 financial institutions, get them around the table, sit my good friend down amongst his friends in the Avenue of Fashion, and let's say, how do we help redevelop this area? Because I can tell you, in minority communities, if you help them gain the opportunity for resources and exposure to hiring more and creating jobs, they will hire in the neighborhoods. Right. We have to create neighborhood stability, and that's where it's going to come from, entrepreneurship.
And Ron, is that as simple as capital, or is there more to it than that?
It's more to it. It's so many layers.
It's even talent acquisition.
Yeah, talent.
You and I've talked before about the mentor issue and trying to create the next generation of young Black entrepreneurs.
Right, and just even trying to find a great workforce is tough. It's tough because we're not developing the talent that we should coming out of these schools, to be perfectly honest. So that hurts you in the neighborhood. So there's so many layers to this conversation. I mean, we could have this conversation for hours upon hours.
But in DPS, the former DPS, I don't know what it is now, when you look at our children.
You only got another 8 years to wait to get control back.
Right. You know, control was taken a long time ago. But from that vantage
14
point,
years.
there are a whole bunch of Rons.
It's a ton of me. They're walking around the halls.
They're
of
looking
BPS.
for resources. They're looking for talent. They want to be successful entrepreneurs. They want to be included. They want to be a part of this vibrant, the success of the city, and they can smell it and
They
see
need
it.
access.
You know,
Absolutely.
You know, Devin, the mayor spanked us a little too, along with a lot of other folks. And I think it is true that if it's not happening in downtown, if it's not happening in Midtown or Corktown, we don't see it. I mean, you've got a thriving district here, people doing really interesting things, and yet, you know, we're hung up on, you know, Selden Standard and Wright and, you know, we talk about the same places over and over and over again. It must get frustrating for the folks outside of those areas.
I find, you know, what tickles me is when someone always, hey man, you need to come downtown. I'm like, for what? you need to come. You need to come to the neighborhood.
My mom was like, why don't I go down? I'm not going downtown.
Yeah, that's what kills me. This is dynamic that feels you have to be downtown. So I wanted to take a different approach. I didn't feel, you know, I feel like there should be more black business downtown because I think there's 44. I think the last time I checked. But I took the approach, okay, they don't want me downtown. I'm going to come to the neighborhood and do what I do.
One thing that's really interesting, so there's a couple points. One is, there's an old saying, it's an old proverb that says, anything done for us without us is not for us.
That's right.
And so the idea that the conversation about inclusivity needs to be more inclusive because you need those that are on the ground in that conversation helping to determine policy and direction. That's a critical point. The second point, I think, is the diversity of Detroit is impressive beyond the black and white. But when you start looking at La Comunidad Latina and the Arabic and community, that's one of our greatest strengths. And I think we failed when we don't take advantage of that and say, best and brightest people from around the world, from around the country, this is a city that welcomes you, and there's opportunity for your dollar to go farther, and for your dollar to go further, and for you to make significant investments and grow a business here. We're failing if we don't say those things. And I think that's one of we've got a lot of strengths. We tend to focus on all of the negative challenges that Detroit has, but we've got more strengths than we do weaknesses. But the challenge is we've got to come together and work together. And if we can't come together and work together, we won't get there.
And it starts with media, too. And so the perspective of media,
Don't go meddling.
thanks to the two people in the center here, you all have lifted discussion. I can tell you when a white man lifts the discussion, people tend to pay attention. So that we appreciate the intentional thought behind that progressiveness. So thank you for that. But media as a whole, yes, we love Dan Gilbert. Dan has done a tremendous job. We love Chris Illich. Great relationships with both of those people. Well, how come we don't have an economic discussion from Ron Bartell? The smaller guys who are in the neighborhoods, who are trying to become the next Gilbert, who are the Gilberts in their neighborhoods, okay? We need to lift up entrepreneurship from a grassroots perspective and bring a new light to the success stories that exist in our neighborhoods.
And Ken, that's what I was trying to get at with the question to Ron about if it's not happening in 3 or 4 neighborhoods, it's not happening.
Right.
But with buzz comes investment interest and investment dollars. And if nobody's talking about the Avenue of Fashion and Northwest Detroit, you don't get the same sort of perhaps national investment or even regional investment attention that maybe the downtown areas of Corktown, et cetera, are getting.
Yeah, even with the media that we get, I had to hire a PR guy for that, and then it comes with the cachet of having played in the NFL. So, like you said, I think inclusivity is the key. I think we're doing a lot of great things. It's not just us. It's my business partner, he has this thing called Hood Thursdays. He goes to support all the different restaurants every Thursday. Him and his fiance go support all the different neighborhood restaurants. So I started joining them. It's so many places that have great things going, and they just don't have access. I bring up Motor City Match. They're like, what's that? So the fact that these businesses are doing well in the neighborhoods and don't even know have a chance to receive funding from a program that was designed to help them specifically is a problem.
And it makes the chamber step forward too. So we say, if we're constantly hearing from folk in the neighborhood that there's no access to resources, capital, talent, acquisition, et cetera, then we have to almost take onus in it ourselves. So we've basically hired an attorney to form our own CDFI, because we're saying, how do we bridge the gap between capital? We're tired of complaining. We have to take ownership in this development process. And so basically what we're doing is that maybe we can be the bridge to Invest Detroit or DEGC to connect these resources. So we have to have a real discussion and a real institutional way of bridging the gap effectively so that Ron can be successful, because I think Ron should have his shop in every neighborhood, not just between a mile corridor.
I think you've all given us a ton to think about. I really appreciate that. The former Mayor Bing, I think, thinking about the difference between diversity and inclusion is just on its own is an awful lot to think about as well. I want to quickly let you all know, because we are out of time for our session. We want to thank the Motor City Casino Hotel for hosting this terrific day's worth of great conversation. You are all invited now to take part in the reception and networking event, which will be going on in the Detroit Experience Hall.